Let's review the Darksword Armory Baron sword with my special guest Matthew Jensen as well. Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So we're going to look here at the Darksword Armory Baron. Spoiler alert, I both like and dislike this sword for completely separate reasons, and I'll go into a little bit more detail here. And also we've got a special guest here who is Matthew Jensen, who does his very own sword reviews on his fantastic channel linked below. Huge thanks to Matt for pitching in here and basically destroying his sword. I'm not going to destroy this one because he's done it for science so that we don't have to. But huge thanks for the footage and opinions that he's garnered. Now, first up, before I go into this and this specific sword, there are an awful lot of things said about Darksword Armory on the interwebs, and some of those things are clearly based on people's individual experience. Some are based on, shall we say, politics or just kind of personality experiences between individuals or groups. But additionally, some of those, I'm afraid, are hearsay and kind of not true. Now, so far, I've received 4 swords from Darksword Armory, and you can see 2 of the reviews I've done previously of the previous ones. There's another one for me to do after this, which is the Alexandria, which will be coming in due course. But the Baron is a new product in their lineup. And I think that Matthew Jensen's review of it and mine are the first ones, anyway, that I'm aware of, the first ones I've seen. Apologies if you've done one and I haven't seen that yet. So, what's special and new and unusual about this sword? Well, quite simply, its design and proportions. So, as you'll see, it has a fairly attractive shape. I'll talk a little bit more about sort of oakshot typologies and things like that in a second, and the historical kind of placement of this, or a historical accuracy of this, if that's indeed a necessary thing in a modern longsword. We'll talk about that. But you'll notice from its proportions, and this is the first thing I noticed about it, it's a nice overall shape, but it's a slightly unusual proportions. It's a particularly long grip for a slightly short blade. So the proportions between blade and hilt are not normal for a European longsword of this period. I say of the period that it is alluding to, which is essentially 14th, 15th century. So if we have a little look at the measurements here, the blade is 31 inches, which is relatively short for a bastard sword, and that is 78.5 centimeters for those of you who prefer metric. Now, for a arming sword, for example, that would be nothing really to write home about in terms of the proportions and length. However, for a sword with such a long grip on it, that is somewhat unusual. That being said, I think in the modern replication world we get a little bit too used to longswords being of almost a standard kind of size and proportion, and I don't at all object to the fact that this is slightly outside of that kind of norm and the kind of average, and we do see in fact in manuscript art occasionally bastard swords which appear to have a relatively short blade with a relatively long hilt. It's not common, but you do see it. Now, this does in theory lead to a sword that you could use quite manageably in one hand. You could use it with a shield or a buckler fairly easily, and it moves okay. It's a little bit sluggish. This weighs 1.47 kilograms. So for a one-handed sword, it's a little bit on the heavy side. For a long sword, it's kind of average, slightly perhaps to the lighter end of the spectrum. But that hilt, let's just measure that, is overall, so to the end of the scent stopper pommel, it is 29.5 centimeters or 11.5 inches or thereabouts. So as I say, it's a pretty long hilt for a pretty short blade. Now, funnily enough, those of you who are familiar with Japanese swords or even certain types of Chinese swords might find these proportions spot on for you, and I don't know whether Matthew didn't mention to me whether he found that, but he is most familiar perhaps with Japanese style swords, and funnily enough, this type of length blade, okay, 31 inches is a bit longer than a typical katana, but in terms of the proportions overall, having a relatively short blade with a relatively long hilt, this does actually make it a little bit like a European longsword shaped katana in proportions. So if your main exposure is to Japanese style swords, you might actually find this a very comfortable fit for you. So I said that I'd talk a little bit about the historical validity of this sword. Now overall, the overall shape and proportions, as I've said, it's not common common or normal, but absolutely it could fit probably more into the early to mid 15th century, I'd say, in terms of its overall size and proportions and silhouette. However, the one unusual, and I'm sure some people will absolutely love it, notable feature about the Baron is the double fullering. Now, the double fullering is actually very, very nicely executed, and you'll notice it starts right inside the hilt, as it should do, and then tapers all the way down the blade and comes very, very close, in fact, about an inch close to the point. And you'll notice that those fullers individually taper down. Now, this is something in the early days of sword replication in the modern world that a lot of people got wrong, is that fullers were parallel all the way along. Not to say that you don't find fullers like that, you do sometimes, but they missed out fullers that taper. So I, for one, really appreciate that they've actually done these tapered fullers. So the two together taper, and individually each one of them taper down to the end there. You can hopefully see that they get really quite slim towards the end, and then we turn into a flattened diamond section near the point. So this is attractive, it is nicely executed, tapered fullers are a thing. Now, do we know of any historical swords that have this feature? There is a sword in, I believe it's in Copenhagen at the National Danish Museum, that is an arming sword, which has a roughly similar blade to this. But I don't know whether that's considered as a genuine historic example. And I know people who strongly suspect, and I am one of those people, and I know other people I respect, who strongly suspect that that is a 19th century forgery. So it looks 15th century, or in fact Oakeshott I think dated it to the 14th century at first sight, but actually it seems to be one of those replicas. Now, it has to be said, shout out to Ewart Oakeshott, the late Ewart Oakeshott here. Amazing person, an amazing researcher, amazing writer. However, some of the swords in Oakeshott's book, which he thought were genuine, are now widely regarded, or known in some cases, to be not as he described them. And I think that that might be one of those swords. So that leaves us without any comparable examples for this type of blade in history that I'm aware of. If you know of any, by all means, please post underneath. But I personally don't know explicitly of any examples of a genuine medieval sword which has a blade with this fullering running so close to the tip. Indeed, there are swords in the sort of type 1920 realm which do have multiple fullers, but they don't run all the way close to the tip like this in this fashion. So, not to say that these didn't exist, this type of blade, this style of cross-section running so with the fullers running so close to the tip. They may very well have done, and it's within the bounds of possibility, but I don't know of any direct historical comparisons for this blade type. That being said, you might not care about that, and as a sword it is attractive. It's almost got katana-like proportions, and it has an overall silhouette of a early to mid 15th century bastard sword that could be used in one hand or could be used as a short longsword. How does the sword handle? It handles really nicely. It's nimble because it's got a short blade with a long hilt. You've got bags of control over this sword, and it, you know, even in one hand, it's not really suited to being used as a one-handed sword, but you can kind of manage, especially if you had a shield or buckler, to fill that void that it's a bit slow as a one-hander, it's a bit heavy. But as a two-hander, there's no denying that it's just super quick and nimble and quite fun to use. And I suppose, thinking out of the box slightly, if you have limited space but you want a sword to train with, and you want to train for fighting in small spaces, or you just have a low ceiling or whatever, or a small garden, then having a shorter blade like this could materially be of an advantage to you. Now, in terms of the build quality, we're going to look at that a bit more with Matthew in a second. We're going to look at him destructive testing one of these swords. A lot of things have been said about the tang construction of Darksword Armory swords. We're going to look at the tang. We're going to look at how his sword, which is pretty much identical to this, stood up to testing, how it lasted. In terms of the edges and using this as a cutting sword. So unfortunately, this is not great, and this is one of the main things that I dislike about this sword. There are lots of positive things to say about this sword, and we'll see the destructive testing in a minute, But one of the main things that really lets this sword down are the edges. Okay, first of all, I can run my hands along these edges. It's a little bit toothy. I can feel it bites a little bit, and I feel it's got potential. And with some improved sharpening, shall we say, with some better sharpening, this could make a reasonably decent cutting sword, I feel, especially given the control you've got over the sword. One issue that comes up, as you'll see in Matthew's test, is the shape of the grip. And the shape of the grip is a little bit thin and round. And although it's easy to index the edge, it can lead to turning in the hand. But we'll see that more with Matthew in a second. But the main issue really here is the edge geometry. So, one of the problems is with these double fullers, it means that the final edge bevel doesn't have a lot of space to provide that bevel. And what they have done here is essentially added a secondary bevel to an apple seed edge. So the main bevel to the edge is apple seeded like this. It's quite a fat edge. And then it doesn't come down to a very fine meeting point, and then a secondary bevel's added to it. This results in relatively poor edge geometry, therefore. Now, this could be improved by essentially getting that final secondary bevel by making it a shallower, more acute angle and rounding out those shoulders. So turning it into a better overall single apple seed edge, okay, rather than having a secondary bevel added to an already apple seeded edge bevel. So the edges are a little bit fat and they're not very sharp, essentially. For that reason, I'm not going to show any of my cutting with this sword because it doesn't cut well. It doesn't cut water bottles well. It doesn't cut branches very well. As you'll see in a second, you can see Matthew Jensen cutting with it against pool noodles and wood and various other things. It doesn't cut very well. However, I don't think that this sword as a design is doomed. I don't think it's doomed to be a bad cutter. In my opinion, the bad cutting is down to the particular edge geometry and the final edge that's been applied to it. I think with some judicious sharpening, this could be turned into a much better cutter than it currently is. In terms of the overall finish, the edges are perfectly straight on both sides. There's no wibbling, there's no twisting. The fullers are very nicely executed. If you run your fingers along the flat of the blade, you can feel some rippling, but you know, that's historically accurate as well. These are forged rather than CNC'd, I believe. Now, obviously, there's some debates over how and where Darksword Armory swords are made, which I won't go into here. But based on the evidence of the sword in my hand, these are forged and then finished off by grinding and polishing. And you can tell that basically because of the rippling that you get along them. If you look at a sword which is purely CNC'd, they tend to be completely flat, with no rippling. Swords that have been hand forged tend to have some rippling. This has got some rippling. So in my opinion, this has been forged and then finished by grinding. In terms of the other fit and finish, the polish of the blade is very, very nice. The bevels are evenly applied. The fullers are very straight with no wibbles or anything like that. The tip is very nicely applied, and the sort of midrib at the tip up here is quite precise. So the blade's very nice, very nicely made overall. The crossguard, we will look at the durability of the crossguard in Matthew's footage in a second. We saw that when he tested the Alexandria, the crossguard turned out to be too brittle. That isn't the case with this one. I'll spoil you slightly there, but we'll see what happens there. This is made of some kind of cast alloy, I believe. It's a steel alloy, I believe, equivalent to stainless steel, or at least a steel with other elements in it. The pommel would be the same, and it is peened construction, you can clearly see at the end. And I can assure you that it is one-piece tang and it is peened at the end, and we'll see that in Matthew's footage in a second. The grip is nicely executed. It is a wood grip with leather over the top with a cord impression added into the surface of it. And the seam is quite nice, although you can sort of, it could be better, okay? The seam along leather is pretty good, but it's not fantastic. And there's a little bit of lip, there's a little bit of a shoulder between the leather and the scent stopper pommel, but overall, nicely put together, nicely executed. I'll just briefly mention the scabbard. The Darksword Armory scabbards are all pretty much the same. They come with the standard construction and belt arrangement. And in terms of the fit and finish, the scabbards are very good and hold the swords pretty snug. If you turn it upside down, at least on mine, it will drop out, but that's no biggie, and it's historically accurate. But quite nicely made overall. The shape looks a little bit modern. It looks like stainless steel. But overall, I think a fairly nice looking sword. Not the most historical offering, but that being said, it's broadly historically inspired. And I think the take home of this sword is the fact that it is a short longsword. It's a short bladed longsword, which you may or may not be looking for. Now I'm going to go over to some testing footage with Matthew Jensen. Thanks again to Matthew for doing this for me. Fantastic. He has completely destroyed the sword, so you're now going to see it get destroyed. You're going to see what it's made of, how well it stands up, and what's inside the grip.
Hello, Matt Easton. Hello, viewers of Schola Gladiatoria. My name is Matt Jensen, and I appreciate you letting me chime in on the conversation here. I, too, was sent a DSA Baron for the purposes of review, and mine is in a slightly worse state than Mr. Easton's is, and I can maybe elaborate on some of the shenanigans that I put this sword through to get it into the state that it's in now, which is wholly broken. Well, I imagine it could be used for something, but it's less useful than it was. Some notes about general usage. I would say that the grip indexed well when it was on here, but I found it to twist in my hand a little bit. I have sharpened one edge of this to a hair-popping sharp, and when I was using it, I found myself accidentally cutting with the reverse side because it twisted in my hand and I hadn't really noticed. So was a little squirrely, but not so problematic. I thought the appearance was quite handsome. Everything seemed to fit well and hold up well, and there were some overlaps near where the pommel is here in terms of fit and finish issues. The scabbard retained pretty well and it didn't rattle a lot, and I thought the sword was overall reasonably handsome. Some of the fullers, when they were terminated at an actual tip, terminated a little oddly and not necessarily evenly, but otherwise I thought the sword was reasonably handsome for what it is. I can't necessarily comment on how historic or it is or isn't, but I'm sure Matt will fill in the gaps there. In terms of usage, I would say that I didn't have a lot of fun cutting it. It has a pretty obtuse edge angle, and while it did cut eventually through pool noodles, if I kept my edge alignment really clean, then it would cut reasonably well. I didn't have the same luck cutting with the Tommy mats, or really any other target that I tested this sword on. It really tended to smash, cut in deep enough, but not all the way, or break some of the branches that I tested. It did retain the edge quite well, and bear in mind that when I'm cutting some of these branches and logs and the like, it's cold outside and they're frozen and they were wet wood, so they're kind of like ice blocks now, and it held the edge. It lost some of the hair popping razor, but it was certainly still quite sharp throughout the testing. What I would say it excels at is durability. So I was able to cut into cans, I was able to cut into brass fittings, steel drums, and the like, and it really didn't diminish the edge substantially. It held up actually really well. I was actually impressed by the tip as well. I threw the sword at a tree and did a lot of stuff to diminish the tip, but I directly tried to slam this tip into a metal barrel when the sword had a tip on it, and it lost maybe 1 millimeter of the tip, but otherwise retained its shape really quite well. And in terms of bending, I was able to put it in the stand and bend it back and forth, and it didn't have any kind of permanent bend to it. It wasn't until I really struck it on the side of a stand and tried to bend it by striking the flat very hard on the side of my stand, it was able to give it any kind of permanent bend, and then a couple strikes on the opposite side and it was back to straight again. So it held up really well. I was really surprised by throwing it at a tree and all of that. Nothing came loose, nothing rattled, and eventually I brought it to what I call the croquet stake of doom, which is just a steel rod. Struck it several times, it didn't break, which is impressive because other swords certainly have, particularly in cold weather. I brought out another broken sword, struck it edge on edge contact to diminish the edge, brought it back to the steel rod, and eventually that broke. But I would say that is high marks in terms of overall durability of the sword and how much punishment it can take and how resilient it is to taking a bend. I then brought it out just to take a look at the tang and some of the under the hood stuff and test the quillions as well. Previously in a Darksword Armory Alexandria review I did, the quillions kind of shattered and flew off into the pond behind me. They didn't do that this time, so this is an improvement, but I might say they're a little softer than they should be. I was using another broken sword to test it, so I'm not sure how analogous this is to anything that the sword might encounter in actual authentic usage, but the quillions didn't break, so that is an upgrade. The sword I was using did cut into and bite into the quillions quite a bit, and it deformed them on every strike. And I was told before that cutting into it while it's braced on the stand isn't necessarily realistic because it doesn't have the same give that a person would who is defending with a gun, you know, defending with the sword. So I did something equally unuseful, and I stuck it in a branch and then struck, and each time the quillions deformed pretty significantly. I didn't get the impression that the quillions would deform and, you know, pinch your hand in the grip or anything. They would likely defend, but they do deform rather easily. The shoulders of the blade look reasonably nice. The hilt held on well, and nothing kind of rattled or came loose during any of the testing until obviously I was striking the quillions. And then when I cut the grip off, it's worth noting that it was epoxied on. This epoxy still is on here. I struck it with a sword several more times and it's still on, so it's pretty durable stuff. But it was just a wood core wrapped in leather, and then the indentations that were on here were not from an underlying cord, but I don't know that that's necessary because the grip did not come off despite any of the punishment that I threw at it. There was a little flap on one side of the grip though, and if you had that and were using the sword not for destructive purposes over a long period of time, it might come unwound or something. So this one did not have the best transition or the little flap to finish off the grip. Anyway, Also, Darksword Armory has been criticized for the tang thickness. This particular example has a very robust and thick tang, and in no case, either the Alexandria that I tested or this one, did the tang or hilt in any way deform or bend or give me any cause for concern. Originally, the hilt had some overlap here. It had some of the pommel overlapped, the transition to the grip, I should say, not particularly well, and there were some lumpy bits in the grip. But other than that, it was overall a pretty good sword. It held up really well. If durability is something you're looking for, and you happen to like the features of the sword, it gets a recommendation from me. But I wouldn't say it's a particularly fun cutter, and so for me, that's what I like to do. I like to smash and cut things in the backyard, and generally, it's not cinder blocks and aggressive, breaky targets. So this one was not as fun for me, but it did hold up really, really well. It seems to be a well-built object. Squirrely a little bit in the hands, kind of hard. It indexes well, but turns in my hand a little bit easy, and some of the features could be a little better in terms of fit and finish. But overall, again, durable, well-built product, and that's what I can add to the conversation. I hope it's been helpful. Thanks for letting me chime in again. Cheers.